Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to have my friend Kathy Giusti here. Kathy is one of my personal heroes, and she has written a book called Fatal to Fearless 12 Steps to Beating Cancer in a Broken Medical System. Kathy, this book is so badly needed. I'm so excited that you've written it. What motivated you to write the book? And then we'll talk a little bit about how we know each other.
Sure, and I'm so happy to be here, Katie. I think over the years, people like you and myself have talked and probably coached thousands of cancer patients. They call us, they know we've been through it. And I think over the years, what I realized was spending time with them just briefly on the phone moved them from the state of fear or paralysis, like, oh my God, I just got diagnosed. I don't know what to do, to a point of action. And so by having worked with all these patients over the years and realizing that these one-on-one phone calls were not a sustainable model to help educate them and inform them, I knew I had to write the book and take what I had learned from all of our journeys together and make it better for all the future cancer patients.
Why is it so difficult to navigate what you call a broken medical system? What is it that keeps people from, well, first of all, the emotional stress is
Mhm.
paralyzing.
It is.
But then once they need to address what's going on, how is the system working against patients?
Mhm. The system is truly broken. And as you know from the book, like I went through it years and years ago with multiple myeloma, and then I've gone through it more recently with breast cancer. It's still really broken. And the reason is it's very vast and fragmented. So imagine when you first hear the word cancer, the next thing that the doctor is doing is saying, oh, well, you need to get to a medical oncologist, surgical oncologist, pathologist, and your head starts spinning because add on all those doctors to future infusion appointments, imaging appointments, and it's up to the patient to integrate it all. You're in charge of integrating that whole team. That's one thing that's super hard. The second is that the science is moving so fast that these new treatments are emerging and they're complex. So now you get on average 16 minutes with an oncologist. How are you possibly going to know all the options available to you in 16 minutes? You have to do your own research and educate yourself. So you've got to integrate the team, you've got to educate yourself. And then the third one is, I think, the money. Like, if you don't play the game the right way and you're not following your insurance or your coverage, the out-of-pocket expenses can be unbearable. And 1 in 3 cancer patients actually have to reach into their savings, call a friend, call a relative to get help, and some go bankrupt. So those three things create this intense fear that can only be resolved in the short term with knowledge and education.
And sometimes it's overwhelming. I know when Jay was diagnosed with colorectal cancer, he was 41 years old. I knew very little about the disease. Reading these medical journals, it was like reading Latin for me. I mean, it's so complicated. And I don't think the medical community does a terrific job of synthesizing and distilling
Right.
information for the average person who doesn't have a medical degree.
Exactly, which is why I wrote the book, because you have to make it in simple terms. You have to be able to take the person from that moment of diagnosis and that moment of paralysis to saying, you need to get educated and we're going to walk you through the steps one by one by one. And if you and your caregiver can just read them, I'll move you from that fear to knowledge and action, which is the most important thing they can do.
I love the way you integrated your personal story, Kathy,
Yeah.
being diagnosed with multiple myeloma first and then later breast cancer, but your original diagnosis with really helpful steps of what the average person can do. Now, not everyone has an MBA from Harvard. Not everyone can create the kind of organization foundation that you did. But let's go back to that
Mhm.
original diagnosis. Tell us about it and what you learned in the process of getting your treatment and your providers?
So when I was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, I remember it was a long time ago. We're talking 1996, even before the internet. And my background, as you said, was in healthcare. I was literally running worldwide operations for a pharmaceutical company when I got diagnosed unexpectedly at the age of 37. And for me, I knew the challenge because now I'm going to Borders bookstore. You read the story in the book, and I'm on the floor with my husband, looking through Harrison's and the Merck manual, trying to figure out what I can learn about this disease. Now, I have a science background and I'm trying to understand, and I'm thinking, just like you said, the jargon's a nightmare. I don't know what I'm going to do with this. And then I have to move from understanding that I now have a fatal disease to going and meeting all of these doctors and saying to myself, well, what is a hematologist, oncologist? I didn't even know what they did, never mind moving on to the pathologist. So I had to move through with my multiple myeloma all the same steps that I walk you through in the book. And what is important is I move you through from that moment of diagnosis and I say to you, okay, that is an overwhelming time. Here's what you need to do at the moment of diagnosis, because doing your research wisely is really important, just like me and myeloma. And then I move you through the treatment, and then I move you through when you finally get to stable disease or remission. But with multiple myeloma, it was very unique, Katie, and you know this too from Jay and with your sister. Like these uncommon fatal cancers are brutal on the patient and the family. And I think in addition to learning the steps that you have to take as a cancer survivor, when I went back to write the book, what I really realized, and you acknowledge this and how I made it so personal, I started reading, the 26 journals I'd written for our daughter, thinking that I would, never be alive to share them with her. And I realized in writing the book, the toll that cancer takes on your family and everybody who loves you. And I think that became a really important part of the book, is integrating, as you said, the important steps that you have to do physically to do well in cancer, but also how it affects your family and those that love you emotionally. And that is the most important part of the book.
How did or how have things changed? You said this was in the late 90s when you were diagnosed, Kathy. And writing this book, did you think about, gosh, these are some of the things I should have done differently?
Yeah, I kept thinking about it, but the interesting thing that has changed the most, Katie, is the pace of science. So back then, in 1996, remember that science was not moving that quickly. So you basically did what your doctor told you to do. There were very few scientific abstracts out on multiple myeloma. It was not hard for me to stay on top of the disease because so little was happening. In today's world of science, now there's so many pieces of information and they're at your fingertips. So that is why the first part of the book really says to you, like, you're going to get overwhelmed. When I go in and put in breast cancer, I got 2 billion hits. I mean, what am I going to do with all of that information? So at some point, that's why I try to say to the patient, start by understanding science is moving fast. That's a great thing. You want to know what's happening in the science, but go to the trusted places. So in the book, if you're just looking broadly at cancer, I say, go to cancer.gov because that's the National Cancer Institute. Go to cancer.net because that's the American Society of Clinical Oncology. And go to cancer.org because that's the American Cancer Society. But you and I also know that going to the disease foundations that are out there and just putting in multiple myeloma and foundation, you will get really good organizations from pancreatic to breast cancer to lung. And you have to be aware of going and looking for those .orgs to help you. So I feel like in today's world, way too much information. Before it was we didn't have enough. And now you've got to be able to sort through it and use it wisely.
And what kind of sources should you avoid? Because as you said, there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there online. A lot of people say, whatever you do, don't go on the internet, don't seek advice from Dr. Google. Are
Right.
there things that warning signs, or are there things that people need to avoid at all costs? Because not only will they be overwhelmed, but it can also be extremely depressing if you look
Yeah.
at things like survival rates and
Yeah.
such.
It really is true. So I think you have to understand when you're looking at these sites, do you trust the site? And then when you're also doing your search, you're trying to see, is there advertising associated with that site? It doesn't mean that it's a terrible site. Like pharmaceutical companies will have advertising affiliated with their site. They're going to pop up fast. But that's not where you want to go right from the start. Where you want to go from the start is to a .org and to a disease foundation if you can get there. But over time, once you know your treatments, it's okay to go to a pharmaceutical company site and look to see what are the side effects of your treatment. That's okay. That's where they have to list it. So it's all a matter of timing. The things you want to stay away from are sites that don't have updated information, and that look like they're really trying to sell you something. And then I think the other piece that you have to be aware of is whenever you go in and put your cancer in, every cancer center is going to pop up because even the cancer centers pay to make sure that they move up on the system. Just because a cancer center pops up does not mean it's the best cancer center for your specific cancer. You and I both know, like, Memorial Sloan Kettering may be great at certain cancers, but if you have myeloma, I might send you over to Mount Sinai because they're doing amazing research there too. But if you don't know that information, you're going to end up even at the wrong cancer center.
It seems unfair to put this burden on someone who's going through the emotional stress of dealing with the cancer diagnosis and, as you said, the impact this has on a family. Are there trusted guides? Are there navigators? I mean, I think there are people who are real, you know, go-to people who want to get this information, who have the emotional fortitude, quite frankly, to do this. My husband didn't really, I did it for
Yeah.
him. You never know how people are going to deal with the diagnosis. So it's upsetting to me that we're putting all the onus on these patients and that oncologists don't have time to help each
Yeah.
patient sort things through. What would you recommend if somebody needs a real human being to talk to help navigate this complicated system, Kathy?
It's such a huge problem, and it's a problem for the patient, and it's also a big problem for the caregiver. So when you look at the amount of time they're spending on their disease, for patients, it's an average of 15 hours a week. For caregivers, it's 18 hours a week. You are 100% right. Finding navigators is actually one of the best short-term solutions. Like, we're not going to fix this broken system overnight. It's going to take a lot of time. It's way too fragmented, but I do believe navigators are a huge part of it. So are social workers and case managers. So my advice is there are navigators available to patients. An example would be at the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation. We have full-time nurse navigators from the cancer centers. They are so smart, and you can call toll-free at any time. Other organizations have navigators that get assigned to the patient themselves. You stay with that navigator for the long haul. And now the hospitals are starting to bring in navigators too. And the most important of navigation is you want the navigators to also look like the patient. It goes a long way if you're a Hispanic patient and you have another Hispanic navigator or African American, like myeloma skews African American. Our patients want to see African American navigators. And then one interesting thing is I just noticed from the moonshot and other things that are going on in Washington that Medicare is starting to pay for navigation, to reimburse for navigation. So I think that's a really good step in the right direction of saying, okay, now if you can get reimbursed for it, maybe the hospitals will put more money into the navigation process. It's critical.
That's so important. I know we're not going to have time to go through all the 12 steps, but can you break them down and how you thought about organizing those steps for this book? Because everyone needs to buy this. If I ever meet someone who's been newly diagnosed with cancer, I'm going to send them this book, Kathy. But
Yeah.
can you just give us some broad strokes about what to do? And this is actually making me anxious because it's bringing back so many memories of desperately trying to find clinical trials, what's going on in pharmaceutical companies internationally. I mean, I was working around the clock for Jay, so much so that I don't think I tended to his other needs, which is
Yeah,
something, that, that I have deep regrets about. But, what kind of broad strokes would you give people to help manage this,
yeah.
both intellectually and emotionally?
Well, you're not alone, Katie, in having all these regrets, because that is the thing about writing the book for me too. Like, I thought I was going to read all those journals and look back at my life and think, oh, look at me, I did it right. I'm still alive and my family's amazing. And instead, I read the journals and went, oh, look at me. Like, I played the cancer card a lot. And my husband sold his company, and Nicole could never have sleepovers. And I think cancer patients and caregivers end up with a lot of regret. So one of the things I do talk about in the book, just from a practical standpoint, is being very conversational about needs and wants. Like, what does the patient really need? Put it down. What does the patient want? So I'm going to put that aside, because no matter what's going on and where you are in the journey, having those conversations with your partner, your caregiver, your family is so important. But if from a practical standpoint, at diagnosis, what I tell everybody is, number one, Google wisely, know which words to use, and be very specific. Say that you're newly diagnosed with smoldering myeloma. Don't just put in multiple myeloma. Be specific. The second part is, in early diagnosis, get a second opinion. I'm always shocked at how many people don't get a second opinion. And third is, make sure your insurance is covering all of this. And when I say that, I mean, call the insurance company, Medicare, whoever is covering you. Don't make any assumptions about that coverage. So those are the three most important things at diagnosis. When you then get into go time, like now you're headed to treatment, I always say it's the 3 T's. So you and I both know this part. It's like, the first part is the team. You can go to a community hospital, an academic center, or an NCI designated cancer center. Whatever you go to the place that is most convenient and appropriate for you, but ask them how many patients they see like you. If you have pancreatic cancer, you want to be in a hospital that treats pancreatic cancer patients. The second part is tests. So you routinely will get your blood tests and your metabolic tests, but we have to ask for the imaging. And you know this on the dense breast side and everything else. Like, you've got to ask for what you need on imaging and make sure that you're being monitored. The other part is biomarker testing and genomic testing, and even immune. Insurance companies are not routinely covering that. So then when you move from your team to your test to your treatment, you need to know what's your standard of care. There's a website called nccn.org, which will give you the standard of care that insurance typically covers. But then you have to watch medical meetings. They happen a couple of times a year. You'll see it in the press when we all come out after American Society of Hematology, and there's new updates all the time.
Or ASCO,
ASCO,
all
huge
these
one.
professional
Yes.
places, and you
Yep.
have to kind of say, how do you find out the latest
Yes.
research, and how do you stay on top of that,
Yeah.
Kathy?
Well, it's fascinating, because if you know when these meetings are happening, they only happen once a year, but that's when all the abstracts and the updates are coming in. All you have to do is go in and type in ASCO and your cancer. And ASCO will bring up every article. And sometimes ASCO does a beautiful job having summary video of what came out in your cancer. And they do it at pretty late terms. So, there's ways now that you really can stay updated. And then, of course, you can go over to clinicaltrials.gov to find out about clinical trials, but that's a little overwhelming. But the foundations often will do all of that work with you with a navigator if you can find them.
I,
So,
I wanted to interrupt for 2 seconds,
yeah,
Kathy, only because I think there's so many misconceptions about clinical
yeah,
trials and the way drugs are developed and brought to market. People have to participate in clinical trials. A lot of people think someone's going to get a placebo while somebody is going to get an experimental drug. Oftentimes, you can't participate in clinical trials if you've already had the standard of care. So,
right.
can you just talk a little bit about clinical trials and sort of the positives and
Yeah.
negatives about participation?
Well, I think now that we're talking about how fast the science is moving, I think it's very appropriate for people to understand what's going on in clinical trials. And once again, they're often covered in those major medical meetings, so that's why you want to stay on top of it. What I always say to patients is know what the trial looks like. If it's a phase 1 trial, it's very early. They're still figuring out the dose. So unless you're kind of a struggling patient with a relapse disease, you may not be going to a phase 1. At phase 2, they know the dose, but they're still trying to figure out the efficacy side and how does it work versus a potential standard of care. And by phase 3, now you know this drug has moved pretty far along, and it's likely a very good study to get in. I think the other part for patients to understand is that typically in these studies, they're looking at a standard of care versus the new treatment. So at worst, you're going to get the standard of care. At best, you can get the new treatment. And a lot of times the studies are crossover. So when the study's done, they're going to move everybody over to the better treatment. So it's not a negative to be in there. In addition, when you're in a clinical trial, they're evaluating you very closely and you're getting tons of testing done. So you actually start to learn a lot about your disease. So there's a really good reason to go into clinical trials. The
Do
other
you
part,
have to go into them, Kathy, though, before you get like the standard of care? Because sometimes people are on the standard of care, or the typical therapeutic
yeah,
approach that fails. Are you still eligible to enter a clinical
yes.
trial under those circumstances?
Yes, and that's where you have to read on, cancer.gov, what are the specific inclusion criteria and exclusion. And so where you have to get into that is, do you have potential risk factors that may not make you eligible for the study? So it can depend on what you've already had, but typically if you've had the standard of care, they can still move you through to a new therapeutic. But if there's other things that have happened along the way, maybe you went into renal failure or things like that, then you may not be able to get into that study. So this is where it gets really complex too. Trying to read the language on clinicaltrials.gov is super hard. But if you call the foundations and get a nurse navigator, they can walk you through the clinical trial. And sometimes the hospitals will do the same thing with you with one of the PAs. The issue is in clinical trials, only 9% of patients enter clinical trials. And yet clinical trials really do help us to know which drugs are best. And the reason patients don't do it is because the doctors don't have time to share all the clinical trials with them. It's a huge time burden on these doctors. So again, it's not bad people, it's not bad doctors, it's just a bad system.
What about things like chat groups? I think a lot of people want to talk to those who are going through the same thing, who are in the same boat. Do you have to be careful about getting too much medical advice from other patients?
You do, because I think every patient has to realize they are an N of one. Your situation is always going to be different. So I do encourage, like, if you are where I was in myeloma, right, a young patient, and for me, I was considering having a child. Like in today's world, if that's your situation, you want to talk to another young mom who might have gone through the same thing. So I think the more that the organizations can help you find people that have been through what you've been through, it's great. But I would also be very careful when you go into these chat rooms that there's just a lot of talk and they're not necessarily licensed professionals. That all it is, it's opinion. And it can be a nice companion, but I would be careful. Again, I think this is why writing the book was so important for me, because I wanted to make sure every patient had the trusted resources to go to, and then to understand, like, you can find mentors, navigators, social workers, people that can help you reach out for those resources.
What are some other important lessons for patients that you write about in this book?
I think the most important lesson that I give to patients is to understand that the journey can be longer, especially today because we're living longer. The journey is a roller coaster. It has so many highs and lows. And the most important thing you can do is state when you're sitting there for the first time and you're realizing you're facing a potentially fatal disease or a really tough illness, that is a time to sit down and write, what do you need and what do you want? And I think it's critical to do that because for a lot of people, it's different. For some people, it's like, I don't know how I'm going to get to work. I don't know how I'm going to take care of my children. I don't know how I'm going to get groceries. And so you write that down, and that's your immediate need. But there's this other part that nags at patients when they're facing something like this. And it's, do I have a legacy? Does my family care? Like, there's so many pieces of this that can be hugely emotional. I'm not saying that they have to write a whole plan around it. You can just write it down on a scrap piece of paper. Like in the book, you'll see me talk about, I went to a Starbucks and wrote down what was the most important thing to me and had my husband do the same thing. And it was on a scrap of paper, but it still said what was really important to us in the process. And I always say to everybody in the book, make that your North Star and don't lose it, because the one thing that a cancer diagnosis does do is it makes you think about your life and how you want yourself and your family to take care of it. And what I found in the book was I kind of lost my North Star. I mean, everything I was doing was, oh my God, I want Nicole to have a sibling. I want my family to grow. I want them to remember me. And, when you think you're dying, you just want to make sure your family is really safe around you. And I got all of that done, and yet I was still working 70, God knows how many hours a week. And I was really missing out on a lot. And so I went back and read the journals and I thought, God, I missed a lot. Like, it was a balance of trying to save my life with trying to live my life. And I think that's what I want people to know is you're going to get into the thick of it. Get yourself organized, get a team around you, and make sure you're keeping those relationships safe, and that whatever is most important to you, you stay with it. Don't go off the rails. And then the other part is you shouldn't have to get a cancer diagnosis to do this. Like, that's just how we should all run our lives. And we don't. We just get pulled in so many directions, and illness is always going to take you on a tangent. It's always going to take your family down a tough spot, and it's really hard to deal with. And we're only starting to learn that now. So you've got to be on your game and talk it through.
I feel so bad for people who don't have access to the best medical care. As you know, we live in a country where some people can afford the best care and some people simply can't and don't receive it.
Right.
How do you wrestle with that, Kathy?
I saw it in multiple myeloma because, again, it skews older male and African American. I was not the poster child for this disease, and it truly was neglected. And then as we were doing tons of research at the MMRF, the foundation that I founded, what we realized was African American patients were doing worse, not because their myeloma was tougher, but because they weren't getting access to stem cell transplant.
And
And
by the
so,
way, I just want to say
yeah,
Black women have a 40% higher chance of dying than white women when they're diagnosed with breast cancer because their cancer is usually more severe. They get diagnosed too late and
yeah.
they don't have access to quality care.
Exactly right. And so the whole system has to start shifting so that access is readily available at the community. Like, stem cell transplant was not being done at the community, but in today's world where new immunotherapy drugs are potentially curative, like bispecifics, CAR T, we have to make it so that those drugs are available at the community setting where African American patients can get them, or we're just going to keep widening the gap. And the other piece I think people are working on is, you do find that African American patients don't trust healthcare professionals as
We
much. So
saw that during the pandemic.
yes, exactly. So you have to start again. This is why I say bringing in navigators and nurse practitioners, physician assistants, and the doctors, and starting to bring all that together will really help to build trust. But I think educating the patients will build trust. The most important thing we can do, and that's why you're so phenomenal in this field, is you have to get screened. Like, you have to get screened and you have to know prevention, because the easiest way for us to solve the problem is to get patients diagnosed early or to prevent it from the start. And 42% of cancers are preventable. No obesity, no smoking, no sitting in the sun, less alcohol. These are things we just have to teach people. But again, I think for you and me, we understand, like, 1 in 2 patients will get diagnosed, 1 in 2 people will get diagnosed with cancer, and yet everybody thinks they're invincible. I don't get it. I don't get it. We're
I think
not.
a lot of it is education. A lot of it is, listen, I sit in the sun even now a little bit, and but the other things I pay attention to.
Yes,
I also think that it's not emphasized enough in certain communities, and then people get set in their ways
right.
and they think, I don't know, they rationalize all kinds of things. But you're right. I think screening is so important. I think genetic testing is
Yes,
incredibly important. So you have some kind of roadmap to determine what kind of screening and how vigilant you need to be when it
yes,
comes to certain cancers. And a lot of people just say they don't want to know. And of
right.
course, then they're diagnosed and they think, if
I
only
know.
I'd been screened more regularly or more often than even the medical experts think you need to be. Knowledge really is power, but
It is.
it's hard to kind of bring home that message for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think we do bring it home now, even to the younger community, because we're seeing the increased incidence in colorectal, breast. And you're watching this and saying, like, the largest group now growing is 50 to 64, but cancer's also starting to skew younger. So, you and I kind of go full cycle now. Like, the book comes to the end, and I'm now looking at my two children, Nicole and David, who are adults, 29 and 26. And one of the most important things I could do for them was to get them to a very good primary care doctor. Because I said to them, you need to understand what your risks are. She needs to know everything about our family so that the risks are right in your charts. And if and when you see something, you have to be ready to go with her, and you need annual physicals. But not everybody that's young is sitting with a primary care doctor. It's not dawning on them that they need to do this. And I feel like this is where raising awareness becomes really important too.
That's so true. And Jay didn't have a primary care physician
Right.
because he was in his 30s, he was healthy, he didn't smoke, he exercised regularly, and you know, he wasn't getting regular physicals. So it's really important. I think women often get into the healthcare system more
Yeah.
because they go to a gynecologist, for
Yeah.
example. But it's
Yeah.
really important for men to do that as well. And also, not only to understand your family history and sort of your genetic makeup, but it's important because one thing I always emphasize, because I think sometimes family history, Kathy, gives people a false sense of security.
Hmm.
I think 82% of breast cancers happen to people who have no family history.
Right. Yeah.
The statistic is similar for colon cancer. So no family history, I often say, is no guarantee.
Right.
So while that helps fill out the picture, it's not the whole story.
Right. And you have to look for symptoms. I mean, you have to be aware of them. And I think that's where, again, we could be doing a much better job of raising awareness and education. So if it is colorectal, like, and, you see blood in your stool and you're young, get to the doctor right away. Like, there are symptoms that people will see and sometimes ignore because they just don't have time. And I think the more we start to focus on early detection, the better off we will all be.
And I do think you may not be the poster child for multiple myeloma, Kathy, but you are the poster child for someone taking matters into their own hands and being their best advocate,
Mhm.
because you did that from the get go. And even more recently with your breast cancer diagnosis.
Mhm.
And, I think gone are the days where people trust their doctors to take care of everything because they're too busy.
Right.
Clinicians often don't know about the latest science because they're so busy, understandably, helping their patients.
Yeah.
But what you did was beyond the pale in terms of starting the Multiple Myeloma Foundation, because it's just been a phenomenal, um, place for people to go to help support research. Can you talk a little bit about how you used your business acumen and your own experience with cancer to form this foundation and what it does and what your goals were?
Yes, so I founded the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation back in 1998, soon after I was diagnosed. And basically, the great thing about my background was I was, a pre-med major undergrad. I'd been working in the pharmaceutical industry, and I also had a business degree. And so when I got diagnosed, I never knew anything about running a nonprofit. I only knew about running a company. Like that's what I was always doing, Merck and Searle and other places that I was going. But now I'm like, okay, I've got to face this disease and I'm going to start a foundation. The whole focus of it, Katie, was to say, okay, there are no drugs in the pipeline for this disease at all. There's nothing here. So having a pharmaceutical background, I said, how will we get there? I sat with the community, and this is where we get back to how we started this conversation. You have to integrate the academic centers, the pharmaceutical companies, the National Cancer Institute, everybody together and rally around the goal. If you don't understand the basic biology of the disease, you have to say, okay, well, what do we need? And talk to everybody professionally. It turns out we needed a tissue bank. Patient samples are gold. Like getting patients' tumors and studying them is exactly what you need to understand your disease. Once we did that, then genomics were starting to move. So we became the first to sequence the myeloma genome, which again allowed the pharmaceutical companies to say, okay, now we know more about this disease. Let's see if we can find new drugs for it. Then once we started getting pharmaceutical companies interested, we built a clinical network to make phase 1 and 2 trials easier to do. And we helped them accrue all of those clinical trials. And then once we started doing that, we're like, okay, data has to be shared. You cannot hoard data in one academic center or at one company. We all need to see it. And so we moved in that direction. So as a result of just kind of like saying together, what's the problem? How are we going to solve it? How will we fund it? How will we lead the process? We were able to overcome so many obstacles, and myeloma now has over 15 drugs approved, and patients, live an average of over 10 years. So it did become the poster child. I was thrilled to take that model and teach it up at Harvard Business School to many other organizations and people in the healthcare systems, and then publish all of that information, which then allowed me to really understand what was going on in pancreatic, lung, and prostate cancer. And that became just eye-opening for me. And then I think that really led me to understanding the importance of getting the book, because I knew the system wasn't going to change overnight. It was going to take time. It's going to take something pretty extraordinary to get it to change. So in the meantime, the patients really needed something else.
So a lot of other organizations followed your playbook, the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, and now they're an incredibly helpful clearinghouse for people who have other very difficult and not so difficult cancers, right?
Exactly. So I think the joy of my work up at Harvard was integrating everybody and saying, everybody has slightly different models and different approaches within this whole cancer journey. Like the way you treat pancreatic is different than lung, which is different than myeloma. But the mainstay of sharing ideas and collaborating is critically important for the patient themselves. So I felt like that was the best thing that we could be doing. What I love about, leaving a legacy and some kind of purpose behind is I did leave the playbook for cures up at Harvard Business School. It's right under the Craft Accelerator. Anybody who's starting an organization can go to that playbook, read our business plans, read everything we taught up at Harvard Business School. But I love where I went with the book, which was, okay, now I need the playbook for patients. And I wanted both to really work so that at the end of the day, no matter how deadly your disease was, how rare it was, how much you were struggling, that you could look to both and start to find hope and progress.
And the organizations that have been built help the individual patients so much. So
Absolutely. And there's so many really great organizations in the book. I interview a lot of them, but you know them, the Pancreatic Action Network, Longevity. There's just a million out there, and people don't know that they do great work. And if you're struggling to know, like, do I love this organization? Just go in and look at their about page, see who's running it, what are their credentials, who's on the board. You can go to Charity Navigator and see what their star rating is. There's a lot of ways. And if they're doing great work, get involved with them. It will make you feel better about your cancer, that you're doing something.
who do you hope will buy this book, Kathy, when all is said and done?
Well, first for the patient, because I think the book is their companion. I think it's can be a lonely journey. There's so much that's in your head and your heart as you move through this. So I want
I
people to know, like,
remember Jay telling me having cancer was the loneliest experience in the world.
it really is. It can be incredibly lonely because you think that really nobody understands what it's like when you go onto the portal and you're looking for your test results, which I still do now. And you've got this knot in your stomach and like this sweat starts to happen over you and you're thinking, oh my God, please let it be good. Please let it be good. And you're petrified. Like it still happens. I've been doing this for decades. It still happens to me all the time. So I want the patients to know that they have a companion in the book and it's without judgment because like even when I say in the breast cancer side, like I'm supposed to be super educated, I still went out of network and got hit with big bills. I still ran into infections that I probably could have avoided if I'd been more on my game. There is no judgment here. It's a hard system. So definitely for them, but then I think the other part is absolutely for the caregivers. And when I say that, now I look at my children who were so young when I was going through myeloma, but adults when I was going through my breast cancer, and realizing they were caregivers. They gave up a lot, you know, when your mom is going through this, you're really worried all the time. Is she going to get sick? Don't get her sick. Stay quiet. Let her get her sleep. Like all these things were going on. So I have huge empathy now for the spouses, the children, the friends of everybody. So that's the second group. And then the third are the healthcare professionals. I really did write this and interview other healthcare professionals in the book because I wanted them to know that the system is broken and I know how hard they work. It's not them. It's not them. They're doing everything they can. It's the system. And I hope they will refer people to the book and understand that it's supposed to be their friend too.
Kathy, the book is Fatal to Fearless, 12 Steps to Beating Cancer in a Broken Medical System. I was honored to write the foreword to your book. As I said, you are one of my personal heroes. I think this book is going to help so many people who are in various stages of newly diagnosed cancer patients, somebody who's in the midst of treatment, and then someone who is living with cancer that never feels quite in your rearview mirror, at
Right.
least for a while. And how, and by the way, some of the treatments can also make you at higher risk for other
Yeah.
cancers in the future, which I think is an area of study that has been neglected personally.
Mhm.
So the ramifications of the treatments themselves. But I think this is going to be really such an important guide for so many people. Thank you for writing it. And thank you for telling your own story because I think that's extremely instructive as well.
Well, okay, I think we're the mutual admiration club because you have done so much work in this field too, and all of your work in raising awareness. And again, you shared your personal story with breast cancer too. So I feel like patients need to know they're not alone, and that there are some of us that are hugely focused on raising awareness and making sure people get screened, and that we focus on prevention too. So right back at you.